What life was really like in 1900s America. As 1900 dawned, a new century unfolded, promising much, yet still bearing the clear marks of the old era. This transitional moment found America not just a land of golden opportunities, but also a place rife with challenges, with unending struggles to shape an unprecedented future. Join us as we journey back in time to explore an America full of contrasts, where technological progress boomed alongside harsh social realities. From life-changing inventions to unimaginable social burdens, we'll uncover the true stories of an era that laid the firm foundation for the United States we know today. America, a nation of opposites. The year 1900 wasn't just the start of a new century. It was a fascinating transitional period, a vivid snapshot of profound change. On one hand, this era still bore strong resemblances to the 19th century, a time that had passed. Queen Victoria was still reigning over England, a symbol of a vast and powerful empire. At the same time, Isaac Newton's laws of physics were still considered the foundational principles governing the entire scientific world, explaining everything from the movement of celestial bodies to the fall of an apple. This shows that, despite stepping into the new century, societal thought and structure were still deeply influenced by old values and patterns. On the other hand, this was precisely the starting point for great changes, incredible breakthroughs that would shape the future of America and the world. The contrast between tradition and innovation, between the old and the new, is the common thread running through the picture of America in 1900. Did you know that the English language in 1900 was still quite small? It might sound strange, but the truth is that many words and concepts we consider obvious and familiar in daily life today simply didn't exist or weren't widely popular back then. Just imagine words like radio, movie, crossword puzzle, tractor, truck, tank, or electronics had not yet entered the everyday vocabulary of Americans. This not only shows a lack of technology, but also reflects a completely different worldview. When the concept of motion pictures didn't exist, how different would entertainment be? Without radio, how limited would communication and connection methods be? It wasn't just technology. Even important social concepts like camouflage, propaganda, cafeteria, vaccination, income tax, feminists, jazz, gospel, neon light, schizophrenic, or psychotic were not widely known or didn't have the same meaning as they do today. The absence of these words isn't just a linguistic issue. It also reveals a significant difference in how people perceived the world, society, medicine, and psychological issues compared to now. Life was simpler, but at the same time, less understood in many complex aspects. At that time, America was such a vast and dispersed nation that there was no such thing as an average American life. The geographical, economic, and cultural diversity created vastly different living situations. The divide between urban and rural areas was incredibly stark and profound. Although about 250,000 miles of railroad were gradually connecting the states, forming a vital transportation network, in reality, many Americans still lived hundreds of miles from the tracks, isolated from the flow of development and the conveniences that railroads offered. Imagine, in distant northwestern states like Oregon and Washington, rivers were still the primary routes for trade, travel, and freight, reminiscent of an era before railroads dominated. And in the vast wild western states such as Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas, remote and isolated farming communities existed in living conditions that residents of the bustling northeastern cities could hardly fathom. Primitive homes, without electricity or running water, and a complete reliance on nature were harsh realities. Modernization was primarily concentrated in the urban areas of the Northeast. This was where gas streetlights glowed brightly, indoor plumbing systems offered convenience, and the bustling life of industrialization was booming. In contrast, most of the country, especially west of the Mississippi and south of Ohio, remained in darkness and backwardness. They had never seen gas streetlights or indoor plumbing, things we consider most basic. This was an astonishing division, showing a huge disparity in living standards and access to modern conveniences between regions. Especially in the South, the economy was still struggling to recover from the severe aftermath of the Civil War, a huge scar on America's map. There was virtually no industrial development in the Deep South, where agriculture remained the main but inefficient pillar. Construction activities, including private housing, lagged far behind the rest of the country, leading to a lack of and underdeveloped infrastructure. By 1900, a sad statistic showed that 9 out of 10 African Americans still lived in the South, and 80% of them worked as sharecroppers, a highly exploitative labor system. The sharecropping system was a harsh reality, a vicious cycle of debt and poverty. Whether black or white, they had to rent land, seeds, equipment, housing, and even food from local landlords. The injustice lay in the fact that landlords had the right to keep secret ledgers, meaning tenants never knew their account status or could question crop prices. As a result, most harvests were not enough to break even, pushing sharecroppers into a never-ending cycle of debt and chronic poverty, a helpless trap. They worked hard, but the profits always remained in the landlord's hands, preventing them from escaping their precarious lives. This is truly a bleak picture of economic and social inequality in America at the turn of the 20th century. Stepping into a new era, life-changing technology and inventions. Stepping into the 20th century, America didn't just change. It exploded with an unprecedented wave of industrialization and urbanization. This was the era of industrial giants and game-changing inventions. Millions of tons of steel were produced from massive factories in Ohio and Pennsylvania, the country's major industrial centers. This enormous amount of steel transformed names like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie into some of the world's wealthiest billionaires, people with immense influence on the national economy. At the same time, the development of the steel industry also turned cities into modern megacities, with unparalleled scale and population density, becoming magnets attracting rural populations seeking opportunities. And who could forget the visionary architects? Chicago architect Louis Sullivan, known as the father of the skyscraper, pioneered steel frame construction techniques. Thanks to him, buildings as tall as 30 to 40 stories sprang up, creating entirely new skylines for major cities like New York and Chicago, transforming familiar landscapes into symbols of modernity and progress. Steel wasn't just used for skyscrapers, it was also a key material for building vital infrastructure, the lifelines of the economy. We're talking about railroads, streetcar lines, and iconic colossal bridges like the Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and East River bridges in New York, or a bridge spanning the Ohio River in Cincinnati. These structures not only connected regions, but also demonstrated America's superior engineering capabilities. Not just above ground, large-scale engineering projects were also taking place underground, testament to humanity's continuous innovation. Subway systems had appeared in Boston and Paris, providing fast and efficient means of transportation. Notably, in 1904, the Broadway subway line in New York opened, reducing a 3-mile journey from an hour to just 10 minutes. This change not only helped people travel faster, but also completely altered how they worked, lived, and perceived space and time in a large metropolis. And we can't forget Thomas Edison, one of the greatest inventors of all time, who consistently amazed the public with his inventions. From electric lights illuminating every home, turning night into day and extending working and living hours, to phonographs bringing music and stories to every living room, ushering in an era of home entertainment, to the kinetoscope opening the door to cinema, starting the film industry that followed. One could say the modern age seemed to explode right from his humble New Jersey laboratory, a symbol of ceaseless creation and innovation. The advent of the automobile was a historical turning point, a symbol of personal freedom and progress. In 1900, automobiles were still a luxury, with only about 8,000 cars in the United States and less than 10 miles of paved roads, indicating unprepared infrastructure. Cars at the time were considered toys for the rich, symbols of status and power. However, Henry Ford completely changed that perception when he introduced mass production in 1908, a revolution in the industry. This method not only created countless jobs in massive factories, but also helped produce cheaper cars, more accessible to the general public. Ford had a big dream. He wanted to make cars affordable for the average worker so that every American family could own one. This very idea, a groundbreaking vision, turned him into a millionaire and forever changed the face of personal transportation. By the end of the decade, there were over 200,000 cars nationwide, and more than half of them were Fords, proving his remarkable success. The automobile revolution had truly begun, ushering in a new era for personal mobility and freedom. Alongside this were breakthroughs in communication and transportation, narrowing distances and broadening human perspectives. The Kodak Brownie camera debuted in 1900, making photography accessible and affordable. Now, anyone could capture memorable moments of daily life, creating invaluable keepsakes for future generations. This was a significant step in preserving memories and sharing images. Italian physicist Guglielmo Marconi sent the first radio signal from England to Newfoundland in 1901, a crucial milestone in communication history. Although initially having few practical applications, a series of discoveries over the next 5 years turned radio into a reality, ushering in the era of wireless communication, connecting people from afar. Electric train experiments began in upstate New York in 1904, and streetcars had appeared in every major city, significantly improving public transportation, making it easier for people to move around in crowded urban areas. And, of course, one of the greatest events, a dream of humanity for millennia, came true. In 1903, the Wright brothers, humble bicycle mechanics from Ohio, made their historic 12.5-second flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Although this event received little attention in the newspapers at the time, overlooked amidst countless other news, it opened the era of aviation, forever changing how we travel, perceive the world, and connect continents. In science and medicine, the 20th century also marked incredible progress, though not all of it happened simultaneously. Albert Einstein, a little-known postal clerk in Switzerland at the time, published 3 mathematical formulas that shook the scientific world, establishing quantum theory and ending Newton's era of dominance, ushering in a new era of physics and the cosmos. However, medicine was the most lagging science, still facing major challenges in basic understanding. Deadly epidemics like cholera, diphtheria, and yellow fever still raged due to a severe lack of understanding of how they spread. But an unexpected solution came from the construction of the Panama Canal. When American engineers applied drainage systems to eliminate mosquitoes, the disease-transmitting vectors, health in the region significantly improved, laying the groundwork for modern sanitation systems in major American cities. This was an important lesson on the importance of environmental hygiene and public health, a turning point in the fight against disease. Social burdens and reform movements. While technology boomed and new billionaires emerged, the lives of most Americans surprisingly worsened as the nation industrialized. This was a dark side of progress, where individuals became tiny cogs in a massive machine. Workers had virtually no power or voice, exploited without the ability to defend themselves. Harsh working conditions and low wages were pressing issues, pushing millions of families into hardship. Labor unions, organizations that could help protect workers' rights, were often deemed illegal, and those who dared to organize unions were treated as criminals, suppressed, and severely punished. One of the most heartbreaking and agonizing issues of the time was child labor, a cruel reality that robbed millions of children of their childhood. In 1900, a terrifying statistic showed that 1/4 of boys aged 12 to 16 were laborers, meaning they had to work instead of attending school. Most of them worked 12-hour shifts in terrible, dangerous, and toxic conditions. Children had to work in textile factories, mines, or in fields under scorching sun, where sanitation was poor and work accidents were rampant. These jobs not only severely affected physical health, causing respiratory diseases and injuries, but also destroyed children's mental health, depriving them of opportunities for education and holistic development. Many teenagers did not attend school, but worked in factories or fields to earn additional income for their families, a great sacrifice for survival. To better visualize life back then, let's look at the numbers. In 1900, the average annual income for a family was $3,000 in today's prices, a figure that might seem decent, but came without any of the basic conveniences we take for granted today. They had no indoor plumbing, no telephones for communication, and of course, no cars for travel. Even more sadly, about half of American children lived in chronic poverty, lacking everything from nutrition to education. This is truly a bleak picture, showing how deeply economic inequality was entrenched in society. However, amidst these social burdens, a powerful wave of reform emerged, bringing hope and promises of fairness. President Theodore Roosevelt, an outstanding and energetic figure known as a progressive, fought tirelessly for a square deal for all Americans. He believed that the unchecked power of large corporations would lead to social instability and injustice, and thus radical solutions were needed to curb them and protect the interests of the people. Roosevelt was the first to challenge the power of industrial and financial tycoons, laying the groundwork for future antitrust regulations and policies. This period also witnessed the strong rise of muckrakers, investigative journalists, brave individuals who exposed the dark underbelly of society and industry, bringing the truth to light. Notable examples include Ray Stannard Baker, Lincoln Steffens, and especially Upton Sinclair, whose shocking novel, The Jungle, exposed the horrific and cruel unsanitary practices in the Chicago meatpacking industry. This book not only rocked American public opinion, but also spread worldwide, leading to the enactment of consumer protection laws and food safety reforms, helping to protect the health of millions of people from contaminated and toxic foods. Social reformers, labor organizations, and religious groups also tirelessly fought to protect children from exploitative labor, a pressing issue. These continuous efforts led to the establishment of the National Child Labor Committee, NCLC, in 1904, a pioneering organization in protecting children's rights. Although the road was long and arduous, these efforts ultimately led to the enactment of important laws such as the Keating-Owen Act of 1916, though later declared unconstitutional for technical reasons, and the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, of 1938, which regulated the minimum age and working conditions for children, largely ending child labor and restoring childhoods to millions of children. What do you think was the biggest challenge for an average American family in 1900, when life was still full of hardships and shortages? Let us know in the comments below. Racial discrimination and the fight for equality. The 20th century dawned, but the heavy burden of racial discrimination still weighed on American society, a stain on the nation's history. In 1896, a Supreme Court decision legalized discrimination. The Plessy v. Ferguson case legalized the separate but equal policy. This was, in reality, just a euphemism to mask brutal and overt racial segregation. As a result, whites-only signs became ubiquitous, from schools, hospitals, and restaurants to public transportation, clearly dividing society. Every public space, from parks to beaches, adhered to this principle, stripping people of color of their freedom and dignity. Jim Crow laws established a deeply and cruelly segregated society, not just legally, but in practice. These laws also turned a blind eye to white violence, especially the barbaric and horrific acts of lynching against African Americans. In the 1890s, a terrifying statistic showed that over 200 African Americans were lynched each year in the Deep South, often without trial, merely on suspicion or simply because of their skin color. Black men also lost their right to vote through new state constitutions promoting white supremacy, stripping them of their most basic citizenship rights. Jim Crow regulations restricted interaction between black and white people to absurd and tragically humorous levels, such as prohibiting playing checkers together in Birmingham, Alabama. Even the name Jim Crow originated from a minstrel character, a simplistic and humorous caricature of African Americans, symbolizing white control and the denial of power, maintaining their social dominance. To protect themselves from constant oppression and violence, African Americans began a slow but resilient migration from the Deep South, where they endured the heaviest injustices. They established all-black towns in Florida, Missouri, Arkansas, and along the Mississippi River, creating self-sufficient, safe communities to escape persecution. Against this backdrop, black leaders tirelessly worked to improve the economic and social standing of African Americans, fighting for a better future. Booker T. Washington, a prominent and pragmatic figure, president of the esteemed Tuskegee Institute, founded the Urban League in 1907, focusing on helping black individuals find employment and adapt to urban life, providing the necessary skills for them to become self-reliant. Washington believed in economic development and vocational education as a path for black people to advance. However, the one who played a crucial role in challenging the system of racial segregation more directly and resolutely was W.E.B. Du Bois, an outstanding writer and scholar with profound vision. He founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which later became one of the strongest voices for racial justice in America. Du Bois made a haunting and accurate prophecy in 1904 that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, a prediction of the decades-long struggle for equality and justice. In 1900, there were 8,833,000 African Americans, making up 11.6% of the total U.S. population. However, their lives were full of hardships. The average life expectancy for African Americans was only 33 years, an alarming figure, comparable to a farmer in India in the early 19th century, while for white people, it was 48 years. This terrible disparity in life expectancy clearly reflected the lack of health care, nutrition, and living conditions. Although slavery had been abolished in 1865, African Americans still did not have true equal rights and faced chronic poverty and violence daily. Nevertheless, the black middle class tirelessly strove to improve living conditions for their people, focusing on education and self-reliance, laying a strong foundation for the great civil rights movements that followed, transforming Du Bois' prophecy into a comprehensive and meaningful struggle. Daily life and entertainment. If you look at daily life, you'll find the pace was much slower than it is now, an astonishing difference. Home life required self-sufficiency and a lot of effort. Everyday tasks were often done entirely by hand, from sewing clothes to save costs, making butter from fresh milk, cleaning the house manually, to hand-washing laundry with soap and brushes, a very time-consuming and laborious job. For laborers and miners, they had to spend most of their day working, with shifts lasting 12 to 16 hours, 6 days a week, an intensity that left almost no time for rest. And as mentioned, a sad reality was that most children did not attend school but worked in factories or fields to earn extra income for their families, bearing heavy responsibilities from a very young age. Regarding education, the landscape was also completely different. In 1860, the entire U.S. had only about 40 public high schools across such a vast area, indicating the limitations of the public education system. Most children attended private schools, church and community-supported schools, or were homeschooled by parents or tutors. One-room schoolhouses were the standard model in rural areas, where all ages learned together in a single space. In these schools, parents often built the facilities themselves, and teachers were paid in kind, such as food, wood, or agricultural products. By the end of 1919, there were about 190,000 one-room schoolhouses across the U.S., demonstrating the prevalence of this model. Learning focused on basic knowledge such as reading, writing, history, science, and mathematics, essential skills for life and work. Despite limited resources and difficult learning conditions, the illiteracy rate among young people in 1919 to 1920 was only about 6%, showing significant efforts in disseminating knowledge. The common teaching method was rote learning, with a deep belief that repetition is the beginning of all learning, emphasizing the necessity of memorization and practice. But life wasn't just about hard work and diligent study. With the advent of electric lights, cities transformed into magical playgrounds at night, dazzling with light and full of life. Sports like boxing, baseball, and horse racing attracted large crowds, creating a vibrant and enthusiastic atmosphere. This led to the construction of new, grander stadiums like Polo Grounds in New York and Shibe Park in Philadelphia, symbols of the developing sports scene. The first World Series was held in 1903 and the first Rose Bowl in 1902, marking the emergence of major sporting events that captured national attention. An unmissable entertainment destination was Coney Island in New York, a massive amusement paradise. It glittered with over 1 million electric lights at night, creating a magical and splendid scene. Along with famous amusement areas like Luna Park, Steeplechase Park, and Dreamland, offering countless thrilling rides, circuses, and unique performances for just 10 cents a turn, attracting millions of visitors each year. In the West, rodeos kept the Wild West tradition alive, providing dramatic performances and extraordinary cowboy skills. A novel attraction at the time was the Nickelodeon, where flicks, movies, were shown for just 5 cents, a cheap and accessible form of entertainment. The first silent film with a coherent narrative, The Great Train Robbery, 1903, became a box office phenomenon, ushering in a new era for the seventh art and changing how people enjoyed stories. In music, ragtime and jazz began to dominate phonograph record sales after they were first sold in 1901, bringing fresh and vibrant tunes. However, cultural critics worried about the social decay these music genres might bring, indicating a shift in aesthetic and social perspectives along with the development of art. Additionally, people often spent time socializing with neighbors, reading books, writing letters, playing musical instruments, doing handicrafts like sewing and knitting and gardening, simple activities that fostered community bonds. Outdoor activities were also very popular, including walking, cycling, playing informal sports, or visiting parks and beaches to enjoy fresh air and natural scenery. Despite the many hardships, life still offered moments of joy, entertainment, and community connection. Of all the changes and inventions of the 1900s that we've discussed, what do you think had the most lasting impact on American life, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments section. The United States' position on the world stage. Stepping into the 20th century, the United States began to assert its position on the international stage. President McKinley declared the success of the open door policy, believing it would stabilize the economy and lead to a glorious new era. He argued that isolation is no longer possible or even desirable. This policy was proposed to counteract the continuous cycles of economic boom and bust of the 19th century, which had caused many social problems. It called for all nations worldwide to abolish tariffs and open up to each other regarding raw materials and investment, promoting global trade. However, McKinley's open-door policy was severely tested in the Philippines. After the Spanish-American War, the United States transformed from a liberating force into a new invader. The Philippine uprising against the U.S. resulted in more casualties than the Spanish-American War itself, with thousands of Americans and over 16,000 Filipinos killed in battle, and another 100,000 Filipinos dying from starvation due to crop burning. This war revealed a deep contradiction in U.S. policy. On one hand, it opposed European imperialism, while on the other, it promoted its own economic and cultural values to other nations. Nevertheless, Philippine Governor William Howard Taft suppressed the uprising not through military means, but with relatively liberal policies, granting Filipinos suffrage and self-governance. In September 1901, a fateful event occurred. President McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz. This brought a highly influential figure onto the political stage, Theodore Roosevelt. At 45, he became the youngest president in U.S. history. Though unpopular with New York's political bosses, he asserted himself as an enemy of corruption and a protector of public interest. Roosevelt strongly used presidential power to protect the public interest. He intervened in miners' strikes, ensuring workers' rights. He also pursued a strong conservation policy, doubling the number of national parks and adding millions of acres to national forests, laying the foundation for environmental protection in the U.S. On the international stage, Roosevelt strengthened the U.S.'s position as a world power. He declared his desire to see America as the dominant power on the Pacific Rim and sent the Great White Fleet around the world to showcase the strength of the U.S. Navy. His decisive seizure of the Panama Canal from Colombia also demonstrated his speak softly but carry a big stick approach in foreign policy. The 20th century also opened with many global upheavals. Rebellions against foreign domination occurred everywhere, such as the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900, the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, shocked Europe when a white nation was defeated by one of the colored races. Signs of the British Empire's weakening began to appear, with Australia granted independence in 1901 and the Boer War, damaging Britain's international reputation. At the same time, threats of war began to form in Europe, especially in the Balkans, with Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1905, leading to the formation of the terrorist group Mlada Bosna, Young Bosnia, the seeds for World War I. The year 1900 was truly a pivotal year, where the past met the future, full of dizzying changes and emotional stories. From technological revolutions to profound social struggles, America laid the foundation for what we see today. We hope this journey back in time has given you deeper insights into an unforgettable era. What was life really like in 1920s America? Step back in time to the Roaring Twenties, where jazz music echoed through the streets, cars began rolling across town, and secret parties stretched into the early hours. It was a decade of bold freedom, booming technology, and changes that shook the world. What made the 1920s such a brilliant era? Let's explore the lives, the dreams, and the hidden darkness behind the glamour of America over a century ago. Economic boom and the new age of consumption. The 1920s are considered the most significant decade for the lives of ordinary Americans, when the first outlines of modern life began to clearly take shape. To understand the vibrancy of the 20s, we must look at the context in which it emerged. Imagine, America had just gone through difficult years after World War I, a conflict that claimed the lives of over 110,000 Americans and forced the entire nation to sacrifice for the war effort. Goods were scarce, and high inflation caused considerable economic chaos. Then, the Spanish flu pandemic in the late 1910s claimed the lives of over 675,000 Americans, leaving a deep scar on the national psyche. But as the war and pandemic ended, a wave of yearning for joy and economic prosperity flooded America. Americans were now not only ready, but eager to spend and enjoy life. This was the catalyst for an unprecedented economic boom. Total national wealth doubled between 1920 and 1929, and the gross domestic product, GDP, increased by a third from 1922 to 1929. The average income of Americans also increased significantly, rising 30% in just one decade. This meant people had more money to spend on non-essentials, creating a booming consumer culture. Mass production and affordability, the assembly line revolution. The key to this prosperity lay in innovations in manufacturing. Do you remember Henry Ford's legendary Model T? It wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of the mass production revolution. Henry Ford, though he didn't invent the assembly line, developed and revolutionized it, helping automobile factories produce cars more efficiently than ever before. This made automobiles no longer a luxury item reserved only for the rich. Opened in 1914, a Model T cost $825, but by 1925, thanks to the optimization of the production line, its price had dropped to just $260, with a car completed every 10 seconds. This is equivalent to about $4,000 today, making it affordable for the average working-class family. The democratization of the automobile changed the lives of millions. From only about 20% of households owning cars in 1920, this number soared to 60% by 1929. There were as many as 9 cars per 10 households. Buy now, pay later, consumer credit, and the spending boom. Not just automobiles, the 20s also saw the birth of a groundbreaking financial concept, consumer credit, also known as buy now, pay later. Department stores began offering installment plans, allowing Americans to purchase items they previously couldn't afford. By 1926, 75% of new car purchases were financed by credit. This financing also spread to home appliances, making it easier for people to own these wonderful new things. By mid-decade, there were over 1,500 credit and finance companies operating in the United States, contributing to a doubling of consumer debt by the end of the decade. While this easy purchasing created a sense of prosperity, it also overlooked the potential consequences of debt, which would later contribute to larger economic challenges. The rise of chain stores and shopping centers. The way Americans shopped also changed significantly. Previously, shopping often meant going to a general store and bargaining for prices. But in the 1920s, chain stores and fixed prices emerged. Sears, Roebuck, and Company, a giant enterprise that built its business on catalogs, opened its first retail store in Chicago in 1924. This was due to the increasing use of automobiles, which reduced mail orders and allowed more people to drive to shop. By the end of the decade, Sears had over 300 stores nationwide. National chain stores increased from 7,500 stores in 1920 to 30,000 stores by 1930. A&P alone accounted for 15,000 stores. In major cities, names like Macy's, Marshall Field's, and Wanamaker's were not just places to shop, they were palaces of commerce. Stepping inside, you would see gleaming marble floors, sparkling chandeliers, seasonal displays, and entire floors dedicated to fashion, home goods, toys, cosmetics, anything you could imagine. Shopping was not just about buying goods, but also an engaging and entertaining social experience for the growing middle class. Colorful, social, and cultural changes. If the 20s were a party, then women were the ones who stirred it up. 1920 was a historic turning point when the 19th Amendment officially granted women the right to vote. This created over 26 million new voters. This event was the culmination of decades of struggle by the women's suffrage movement. After gaining the right to vote, women had more social power, and this was reflected in laws and policies improving working conditions, wages, inheritance rights, and divorce agreements for women. The most iconic image of this decade is perhaps the flapper. These were young women with bobbed hair, short dresses, who drank, smoked, wore heavy makeup, and said improper things, while also exhibiting more sexual freedom than previous generations. Although in reality, most young women in the 1920s did not do all these things, the flapper image became a symbol of women's independence and freedom, especially for young white urban women who were more likely to take advantage of new social liberties, largely thanks to the booming economy. Additionally, many new professions opened up for single women in offices and schools, with wages that made them more independent. With a desire for freedom and independence, fashion also changed significantly. Skirt lengths went from floor length to ankle and knee length. A key figure in the revolution for women's autonomy was Margaret Sanger, a pioneer in birth control in the United States. She founded Planned Parenthood, significantly contributing to women's sexual liberation and their ability to determine their own future. Access to contraception, including diaphragms, helped reduce family size and increase the average marriage age, giving women greater control over their reproductive decisions. Despite facing opposition from conservative and religious groups, the conversation about female sexuality advanced irreversibly by the end of the decade. The 20s are often dubbed the Jazz Age. Jazz music, with its origins in African American communities in New Orleans and Harlem, exploded and became the most exciting form of music of the time. Nightclubs like the Cotton Club in New York City and the Aragon in Chicago became destinations for live music and dancing. New dances like the Charleston, Black Bottom, and Flea Hop became a craze, and dance floors were always full of energy. Radio and movies created a truly nationwide popular culture. People everywhere could listen to the same music, watch the same movies, and share the same moments of entertainment. A man in Alabama could laugh at the same joke as a woman in Oregon. A child in Detroit could imitate the same dance move they saw in a movie that weekend. This cultural explosion was not just about fun. It gave people a sense of belonging, of shared experience. The 20s were also a period of brilliant literary creativity. The Harlem Renaissance in New York became a cultural hub for African American artists, musicians, singers, and writers. Many African Americans believed that artistic endeavors were a way to gain equality by demonstrating that they were equal. Works like F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby are often described as the quintessential novel of the Jazz Age, reflecting the extravagance and excitement of this period. Architecture and design also saw the birth of the Art Deco style, with skyscrapers like the Chrysler Building in New York City, which began construction in the late decade. These cultural and social changes were truly remarkable, weren't they? What do you think about these changes? The role of government. While the daily lives of Americans were undergoing great changes, the role of the federal government was characterized by a hands-off philosophy, a significantly different approach from what we usually see in other historical periods. Laissez-faire policy. The federal government, led by the Republican Party, especially under Presidents Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, adopted a laissez-faire, invisible hand, approach to the economy. This meant businesses were not heavily regulated, with the belief that this would make the rich richer and stimulate economic growth. This philosophy suggested that the government should intervene minimally in business activities, believing that improvements would naturally occur. President Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, who became president after Warren G. Harding's death in 1923 and served until early 1929, was often called the Great Restrainer. He was known for keeping the government out of economic and social activities, an approach some considered doing nothing, but which was actually a very active policy. Along with Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, President Coolidge implemented the first major supply-side tax cuts in American history, reducing the top tax rate from 77% in 1918 to 25%. Surprisingly, tax revenues increased, including from the wealthy, whose tax rates saw the steepest cuts. This was largely due to better compliance as tax loopholes were eliminated. Under Coolidge's leadership, deficits disappeared, and the federal government generated a surplus every year in the 1920s. Coolidge and Mellon, along with Congress, reduced the federal debt, and the economy boomed. This is seen by modern economists as evidence that stimulus is not always necessary to achieve economic growth. What did Coolidge do? He restrained wasteful spending, fought for tax cuts, and ensured the government stayed out. He appointed commissioners to the Federal Trade Commission and the Interstate Commerce Commission, who did little to restrict the activities of businesses under their jurisdiction. The regulatory state under Coolidge was so thin as to be almost invisible. He vetoed agricultural subsidies twice. Many bad ideas emerged, and Coolidge's job was to say no. Although he had some progressive policy priorities, his view was that those issues belonged to the state and local levels, and the federal government was not permitted to interfere. Will Rogers, a famous humorist, said of Coolidge, "He did nothing at all, but that's what we wanted him to do." But this is completely wrong. Coolidge worked hard to defeat bureaucratic expansion, cut tax rates, curb spending, constantly say no to bad ideas, and implement institutional reform by introducing a budget process. He was a silent reformer. Technological revolutions shaping daily life. The 1920s was a time when the middle of the S-curve of many important technologies coincided, leading to the rapid spread of inventions from being toys of the rich to common utilities, changing the way ordinary people lived. Daily life was incredibly reshaped by scientific and technological advancements. Electricity changed everything, light and comfort in every home. At the beginning of the 1920s, only about 30% of American households had electricity. By the end of the decade, this number had increased to nearly 70%, leading to a real change in daily life. In fact, Calvin Coolidge's father's home in Vermont also lacked electricity in 1923, when he had to be sworn into office by oil lamp. Electricity was significantly improved as alternating current AC became standard. With electricity, oil lamps were replaced by electric lights, and household electrical appliances such as irons, toasters, washing machines, and vacuum cleaners appeared. Electricity revolutionized home life, largely eliminating daily chores, giving women more free time to pursue social, cultural, and educational activities. Electricity also transformed the economy. In 1914, only 30% of manufacturing was electrified. By 1929, that number reached 70%. It's noteworthy that this massive electrical infrastructure development, including power plants and wiring systems, was not carried out by a major federal program, but primarily built by private utility companies. Automobiles, freedom on four wheels, and the reshaping of the American landscape. And the biggest revolution has to be the automobile. They brought immense changes to people's way of life. Previously, people needed to live near the smoky factories where they worked. Now, they could move to more pleasant places, and automobiles made that possible. Cars also reduced rural isolation. By 1929, most farmers had cars to go to town, connecting them to the outside world. Like electricity, this transportation revolution also did not happen due to government programs. There were no federal spending bills to build the necessary network of gas stations for drivers. Instead, gas stations sprang up as people realized they could make money operating them. This led to the reshaping of the entire American landscape. Dusty roads were paved, bridges were built, and gas stations appeared everywhere. However, this development also came with new challenges, such as traffic congestion and accidents, leading to the formation of concepts like traffic lanes, stop signs, speed limits, and road markings, things we take for granted today. Media explosion, radio, movies, and the birth of mass culture. The 1920s also witnessed a revolution in media. Telephones, phonographs, radio, and movies became integral parts of daily life. Radio, from being almost non-existent at the beginning of the decade, became a common feature of American life. The first commercial radio station in the United States, KDKA of Pittsburgh, aired in 1920. Just 4 years later, there were 600 commercial stations across the country, and by the end of the decade, over 12 million American households owned radios. Major radio networks emerged in the 1920s, creating mass media. Thanks to radio, people from all walks of life, whether in a New York apartment or a Kansas farm, could share the same moment, the same emotion, listening to news, live music, sports games, and even radio plays. If radio allowed you to hear the world, then movies allowed you to escape into it. The 1920s was also the first true golden age of cinema. Hollywood, California, became the center of film production. Initially, all films were silent. Audiences would watch the story unfold on screen while a pianist or small orchestra played background music. Emotions were conveyed through expressive faces and flickering black and white images, with intertitles to fill in dialogue. By the mid-1920s, an estimated 50 million Americans went to the movies each week, an astonishing number considering the total U.S. population at the time. And then, in 1927, everything changed completely. The film The Jazz Singer was released and introduced most Americans to something entirely new: talking pictures. From the moment audiences heard Al Jolson's voice, they were captivated. Overnight, the silent film era began to fade, and talkies became the new standard. By the end of the decade, movie theaters were not just places to watch a story, they were places to be carried away, where stories were grander, laughter louder, and tears more real. Movie stars like Charlie Chaplin, Gloria Swanson, Rudolph Valentino, and Tallulah Bankhead became household names. They were not just actors, they were icons, shaping beauty, charisma, and the captivating new American dream. Sports also boomed, with legends like Babe Ruth in baseball and Jack Dempsey in boxing. Household conveniences and medical advances. Besides entertainment, scientific and medical advancements also significantly changed life. Infant mortality rates dropped sharply. Doctors began to have better knowledge of what they were doing. The invention of insulin in the early 1920s by Frederick Banting and Charles Best revolutionized the treatment of diabetes, and the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly quickly produced it on a large scale. Vaccines against diphtheria, 1923, whooping cough, 1926, and tuberculosis, 1927, were also developed. The discovery of penicillin in Europe in 1928 also ushered in a new era in treating bacterial infections. Home life also became more convenient than ever. Indoor plumbing, clean water, sewers, and gas, which were almost non-existent in 1920, became common by 1930. That meant the end of outhouses, fetching water from pumps, and cooking on coal stoves. This convenience freed people from heavy daily chores, providing more time for leisure and other activities. Engineering and architecture, touching the sky and moving faster. The 1920s also witnessed extraordinary innovations in engineering. The use of more advanced building materials allowed Americans to construct taller buildings. For example, the construction of the Chrysler Building, a famous Art Deco architectural icon in New York City, began in 1928 and was completed in the 1930s, briefly becoming the world's tallest building. Plans for the construction of the Empire State Building were also initiated in the 1920s. Urban centers became more densely populated, partly due to improvements in water and sewage systems and electricity. In transportation, besides automobiles, cities also built trolley systems to help residents move around more easily. This convenience brought a sense of freedom, independence, and a new rhythm to the daily lives of millions of city dwellers. Even aviation took off in this decade, although flights were still noisy, cold, and time-consuming due to frequent refueling. However, for those who dared to try, flying offered a thrill and a glimpse into the future. Which of these technological advances or modern conveniences surprised you the most? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Hidden challenges and tensions. Behind the cheerful and glamorous images of the Roaring Twenties, an undercurrent of dark forces and simmering tensions existed, threatening to erode the foundations of American society. Prohibition era. First, there was the Prohibition era. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1919, prohibited the manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquors. At 12 a.m. on January 16, 1920, the Federal Volstead Act officially took effect, closing every saloon, bar, and public house in the United States. From then on, selling any intoxicating beverage with an alcohol content greater than 0.5% was illegal. The purpose behind prohibition was to create a more moral, disciplined, and sober America. Supporters of this policy, especially dry activists from the temperance movement, believed that eliminating alcohol would help solve many social problems. However, this policy led to unintended and undesirable consequences. The federal government lost $11 billion in tax revenue. Prohibition pushed the liquor trade into the black market, leading to a boom in bootlegging and secret bars called speakeasies. Organized crime syndicates like Al Capone's in Chicago thrived, controlling the illegal alcohol market. To circumvent the ban, people found creative ways to hide their liquor, from fake books and table lamps to coats and walking sticks. Smuggling operations occurred on a large scale, with sophisticated methods to conceal goods. Speakeasies were discreet places, sometimes disguised as bookstores or bakeries, where vibrant jazz music and forbidden alcohol were freely consumed. The name speakeasy came from customers being asked to speak easy, speak quietly, when ordering drinks to avoid drawing attention. Although illegal, they were often the most welcoming and lively places in town, where people from all walks of life came together to enjoy the thrill of rebellion, the joy of music, and the simple pleasure of drinking with friends. However, prohibition failed to stop people from drinking. It only changed where and how they did it. Ultimately, the 18th Amendment was repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. Cracks in the picture of prosperity. Despite widespread prosperity, wealth and affluence were not enjoyed by everyone. In particular, African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, and new immigrants faced economic barriers and discrimination. For instance, their race or nationality alone made it very difficult for them to obtain business loans. African Americans migrated in large numbers from the rural South to northern cities during the Great Migration, hoping to find steady jobs and better living conditions. However, even in the North, they still faced harsh discrimination in housing and employment. Many were pushed into crowded, unsanitary urban slums and excluded from labor unions. Culture wars, science and religion on the public front. The 20s also witnessed fierce culture wars. The 1925 Scopes monkey trial was a famous example of the deep divide in American views on science and the acceptance of scientific theories. In this trial, a science teacher named John Scopes was charged with violating Tennessee state law by teaching evolution in a public school. The case captured national attention and highlighted the clash between traditional religious beliefs and modern science. Education policies varied across states, especially between those with centralized curriculum control and those with local control, which ultimately determined whether teaching evolution was allowed. In addition, anti-immigrant sentiment was widespread. The Immigration Act of 1924 severely limited the number of people allowed to enter the United States by using a quota system and virtually banned all immigration from Asia. This reflected fears of communism and a desire to preserve what was seen as America's racial composition. Agricultural decline, the forgotten economic basin. Despite the booming economy, the agricultural sector faced severe difficulties. In southern states, where agriculture remained the main industry, sharp drops in crop prices harmed the regional economy. Traditional industries in the South were declining, and poor workers, especially African Americans, were most affected. Farmers had thrived during World War I when the government subsidized agricultural prices to support the war effort. But when that ended, farmers' incomes plummeted and farms weakened. Labor and unions. Labor unions lost their influence in the 1920s after gaining acceptance for their role in the World War I effort in previous years. Americans grew increasingly fearful of the influence of communism. Major strikes in the steel and mining industries ended in failure, and union membership declined sharply. Among the policies reversed for American workers, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1923 outlawed the minimum wage, a ruling that would last for 14 years. Economic inequality and the stock market crash. And finally, the decade's vibrancy ended abruptly. An estimated 40% of Americans lived in poverty. The stock market soared, and by 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had reached 6 times its value in 1921. However, less than 1% of Americans owned stocks at the time, so large profits were not widely distributed. Buying stocks on credit contributed to market instability. By the end of the decade, the market crashed in 1929, signaling the beginning of the Great Depression. Although the market crash was not the sole cause of the Great Depression of the 1930s, it signaled the beginning of that difficult period. And that's an overview of one of the most extraordinary decades in American history, the Roaring Twenties. We've witnessed a nation exploding with energy and innovation, from rebellious secret speakeasies defying prohibition to a revolution on wheels reshaping roads and cities. From radios broadcasting the latest music and news to silver screens dazzling with glamorous stars. We've traveled on luxurious trains, lost ourselves in captivating department stores, and felt the sand between our toes as beaches became playgrounds for everyone, not just the rich. It was a time when anything was possible. The future was bright, fast, and full of promise. But as the decade drew to a close in 1929, everything changed. The music gradually faded, the laughter quieted, and the next chapter of American life would be very, very different. The simmering challenges and tensions, from economic inequality, racial discrimination, to culture wars and the stock market crash, led to a new era of hardship and challenges. Thank you for watching. If you loved this nostalgic journey, please hit like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our exciting upcoming videos, and share this video with friends to explore more fascinating historical stories together.